everybody, welcome back to my channel. In today's video I'm going to go through a watercolor painting tutorial on how to paint this beautiful woodland landscape. Here you can see the final painting that I'm going to be working through in this tutorial. And firstly, let's talk about the materials that I'll be using for this tutorial. I'm going to be using my Cotman watercolor set, but you can use any watercolors that you have. I am using some cold pressed watercolor paper. This is from Fabriano Artistico range. And all of the materials that I will be using will be listed out in the description if you want to check them out. I've got my water jars ready, some paintbrushes, and also a tea towel for blotting off my paintbrushes. But let's get straight into it, and I start off by mixing out my colours. Now we're not going to be using too many for this woodland landscape, we're just going to be using a blue for the sky. I'm also going to mix up a couple of shades of green, so more of a yellowy tone green, and then more of this brighter bluish green, but really you don't have to have these exact shades. And I'm also going to be mixing up a darker brown as well. And we're just going to start off with those four colours. Now I did a basic sketch outline. Really I just blocked in with a graphite pencil the main trees for this woodland landscape. But before I go in with the watercolors, I always use this kneaded eraser to lighten up that sketch. So if you do go in with a graphite pencil and put down any sort of sketch, make sure that you really lighten it up so that the graphite sketch doesn't peek through all of our watercolor effects, because that won't really help with the style that we're going for here. I'm trying to do like quite a loose expressive style for this painting, but you can make it as realistic or as expressive as you want it to be. It's all down to your own personal style, just have fun with it. So to start off with this tutorial, I'm going to be using the wet on wet technique, which means that you need to start off by pre-wetting the surface of your paper, just using clean water from your water jar. And I make sure that I get into all of the corners and all of the edges of the paper. I've had definitely a few mistakes where I've missed out edges before, where you can end up getting harsh lines. So make sure that you do wet all of the corners. And then I go in with that first blue colour and I'm just working it through the top part of the painting where the sky is. I make sure to leave a little bit without the blue to act as like sun, where you want to keep it white so that we have some sunlight peeking through our trees. But you can see that that is very subtle, it's just a very subtle layer of the blue. Now I'm going in with that first yellowy green, and I'm using this to start to build up where the foliage is. And we're working with a lot of layers in this tutorial, so I'm starting off very lightly. We want a really nice light wash, and then we'll gradually get darker as we build up more and more layers. And I'm just tapping in that green watercolor wherever I can see foliage and leaves on the trees, and I just let it bleed out into the wet surface. We wanted to use the wet on wet technique for this particular part of the tutorial because we want to get a nice out of focus look for the background, and then as we build up more layers we'll build up more details which will be more in focus. But I always like to start off with a wet and wet layer just to block in where everything is. I'm darkening up that wet and wet background by going in with our second green colour, which is slightly darker, and I'm using this to block in the darker areas of the foliage and also the ground. And in my reference, the ground also had a lot of leaves and a lot of grass to it, so I'm going to be working a lot of the green throughout the ground portion as well. You can use any reference for this and the techniques will still apply, so don't feel like you have to copy this exact woods. You can use any trees and greenery that you want, any reference that you want. I also work some darker green throughout the ground, and you can see that when I am doing the ground, I'm going with more horizontal motions so that there's a clear difference in the texture and the look between the foliage for the trees and the ground. And I'm going in with that darker brown to add some shadows as well. Now I'm going back to the top half of this woods and I'm starting to build up some darker shadows using a bit of that brown mixed in with the green to give us a darker green tone. And I really do just keep building up layers in the same way to start to get darker and darker, because the really light washes of colour are going to look really distant and in the background, And then as we add more details and really start to darken things up, it will add more contrast to our work, but it's also going to give us more depth. Now that we've blocked in our wet and wet background, it's time to actually start to add in the foliage details. And I love using a little bit of a washing up sponge for this. I literally just tore this off of my washing up sponge. It's got a big dent in it now. And this just works perfectly for adding texture. You can see that we've got bits with bumps, which really helps to give us lots of texture, but then you've also got a flatter side. So you really can experiment with this. And the sponge really does give you a realistic looking but expressive foliage texture. And you really don't have to try very hard to get a really impressive texture with this sponge. To use this technique, I simply go and I dip the sponge into the color that I'm using, and then I tap it on to the paper. And you can see that it gives us a very speckledy look, which really does give the look of those individual leaves and foliage. And because we're doing an expressive style, we don't need to paint in every single leaf. We're just trying to get in the impression of leaves. And I just go and I use this technique all throughout the foliage, and I look to see where the main clusters of leaves are, especially on the trees. And I try to follow the reference a little bit. We don't have to follow it too closely, but I do like to make sure that I'm getting in the right sort of shapes and structures of the foliage and the trees as well. I'm also darkening up and adding some more layers to the ground, going in with some darker green as well. It's very important that you do make sure that you get in those darker colours, otherwise your painting will look a bit flat. Also, bear in mind that when you work with watercolours, they do dry a little bit lighter than they look when they're wet. So I do like to go really dark in some areas because I know that it will dry lighter as well. So even if it looks a bit dark when it's wet, bear in mind that it does lighten up a little bit once it starts to dry. And it is so important that you do get in a variety of values. I mixed in a little bit of black into my paint just to get it even darker, but I still make sure that it's some shade of green. So I don't just use black on its own, I mix in a bit of green. And if you just add a little bit of the paint to the sponge, but keep the sponge fairly dry, then it helps to really create those individual speckledy look of the leaves. Whereas if it's more wet, then you're gonna get bigger clumps of paint come off onto your paper. It's hard to explain, but if you try it, you'll know what I mean. And if you want to have a bit more control, you can go in with smaller brushes like I'm doing to paint in little bits of foliage by using a bit of a tapping motion. And I just continue to build up multiple layers all the way across the background. As you can see, I'm leaving the trees for now. I'm trying to mist them out, so I'm not adding any paint to the actual tree trunks. We will be painting them in a bit, but at the moment we're just focusing on getting in the foliage. Here you can see we really do get that foliage texture when you just use a tiny bit of paint on the sponge. And you get more of a speckledy look when you use thicker paint on your sponge than when you use really diluted paint. We're working on our final layer for the foliage now, so I'm making sure that I get it as dark as I want it to be, mixing in quite a bit of black, and I'm just going to work this throughout a couple of parts of the background. As you get darker and darker, you won't need to apply that paint in as many areas, so make sure you don't go overboard with the shadows. Now, before we move on to painting in the trees, if you want to learn how I create my watercolor paintings in real time and follow along with over 300 real-time drawing and painting tutorials, then you can get all of these on my Patreon for just a small amount per month, and you'll get all of the resources you need to follow along with my tutorials. But if a monthly membership isn't right for you, then over on my website, I've got lots of individual courses. If you just want to focus on improving at one specific medium, like watercolors, you'll be able to find a course that suits your needs. Just like my Patreon, you'll get access to all of the resources you need to follow along with the course, including the reference image, materials list, and sketch outline. And once you enroll in the course, it is then yours to keep, and you can go back and watch the tutorials as many times as you want. So if you are interested in my courses, you can get 15% off if you use the code SAVE15 at checkout, and I'll leave a link in the description to my Patreon and my course website so that you can check them out. But let's get straight back into the painting tutorial and let's move on to painting in the trees. So this is when everything really starts to come together. And for this, I mixed a bit of Payne's grey, so that's a bluey grey, a bit of black and a bit of dark brown together, and I added in some water so that we're starting off with a really light diluted paint. And I go in and I use a smaller round paintbrush to start to sketch in where all of the tree trunks are. And I'm not working on the two main ones at the moment. At the moment, I'm just focusing on painting in a few little ones in the background. But I do want to add in two big tree trunks right in the front. You can see that I'm doing my lines for the tree trunks rather curved, not just straight. I like to add a bit of curvature to them. And to make certain parts of the tree trunks a little bit lighter, I like to go in with the tissue like this, and I just use that tissue to blot up a bit of the wet paint wherever I want a bit of highlight to be. For example, where the sun is peeking through some of the tree trunks, I like to go in with that tissue and just blot off a bit of the paint where the sun is shining through to give the look of the sunlight hitting that tree in those specific areas, so that it's darker at the bottom of the tree trunk and then it gets a bit lighter. This tissue technique is great if you do want to lift up a little bit of the paint, but it only works whilst that watercolour is still wet. So make sure you act really quickly when you're using a bit of tissue. And I just go and repeat this process for as many trees as you want. The trees in the distance are going to be a little bit lighter and a little bit more blurred out, and then the ones more in the forefront of the painting and closer to us are going to be a little bit darker, a little more in focus, and will have more detail to them, especially the two big trees at the front as well. You can see I'm gradually adding in a bit more detail to some of the trees and going in with a bit of a darker paint to darken them up, especially right at the base of the trees. And then once you've added in all of those thin small ones into the background, it's time to work on adding in these two big ones right at the front. And I'm going in again with that diluted paint. We're not going straight away in with really dark thick paint. I like to keep it quite light as I block in the shapes, and I'm just blocking in the shape of those tree trunks. I like to map out all of the little branches and just block it in and make sure that I'm happy with it before I commit to adding really dark paint, because it'll be a lot harder to remove jet black paint than it is to remove a light wash of grey. And then once I'm happy with everything, I then go in and drop in some darker colours wherever I can see shadows on the trees in the reference image. And once again, make sure that you remember that watercolours dry lighter than they look when they're dark, so you might need to keep going back in and build up more shadows once you've waited for specific layers to dry. I want to make these tree trunks really dark so that they stand out and pop, and I make sure to switch to a smaller brush when I do these little thin branches that are coming off from the main tree trunks. It's important to add little details to the main tree trunks as well, so I add in tiny little branches coming off of the main trunk. And you can also go back in with your greens and your sponge to add in some leaves and foliage over the top of some of those branches as well, to tie the tree trunk in with the foliage, make it all look very coherent and to make the foliage look part of that tree. Going back in and adding these little thin details, which helps to make it look more realistic. But to give it more of an expressive style, I like to add in a few splatters as well, just by tapping on the back of my paintbrush. And you can do this with the black or with the greens or any colours that you've used, and this just gives it more of a loose, expressive style. But it's up to you how realistic or how expressive you want to make your painting. If you want to make it really loose and expressive, then you can try adding less details, adding less harsh outlines, keeping things a bit more blurred out and softened out, and adding more splatters and cool techniques like that. And I'm just finishing off each of these tree trunks by adding any final details. Still using that really thin round paintbrush. You can also go in and darken up the ground. You want everything to tie in together. So now that we've painted in those really dark trees, the ground looks a little bit light in comparison. So I'm just going in with that same color and I'm just working it through some of the shadows in the ground. And adding in shadows to the ground gives it more of that bumpy texture, which it was. It definitely wasn't a smooth floor. You can mix in some brown with that black paint and some green to make it look more natural. But now we're coming to the end of this painting, so I just finish off by adding in any little details that I want to, and I add in some expressive techniques like more splatters, this time using the lighter greens as well. And you can go in and add a bit more saturation to the painting if you feel like you need to. For example, I am by using some brighter, more vibrant greens. And I'm just going to finish off this painting by adding in the little bit of the fence that you can see in the corner, the bottom right hand corner of this painting. Just getting in that wooden panel, and I'm going to get in the little wires that are going across using a bit of white gouache so it stands out. Using a nice thin brush, I'm going to use that white gouache to not only add the wires to the fence, but to add even more splatters, because you can never have too many splatters. And you can also use the white to add in highlights. If you need to brighten up any areas, you can use white gouache or a white gel pen, something like that. For example, you could use a white gel pen on these fence panels. But here you can see the final painting. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you're new around here, and even tick that bell icon so you do get notified on my future videos. But that is it from me, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye everybody.